Welcome to Full-Time Grievers, where we're with you on the journey of healing from losing a loved one. I'm Nathan M. McTague, founder of the Center for Emotional Education.
And I'm Selysa Love, founder of Sacramento Reiki Center. We share what has worked for us and for hundreds of our clients, wading through the waves of grief and moving forward with life.
So this week we wanted to delve into the topic of survival reactivity versus emotional processing during the grieving process, but maybe even touching some on emotional overload versus emotional processing as well.
Yeah. I think they're super correlated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think we should start by just validating that it's super common to have survival reactivity first. And often people don't understand what they're going through. But to know it from a philosophical point of view when you're not in it will better equip you to identify it when you are going through survival reactivity.
Yeah.
And it'll help you move through it faster.
Yes. Okay. I have some examples. I know you have some examples. Should
Yeah.
we just get right into it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's hear them.
All right. Well, my brother passed. It was only a few months ago. It'll be 4 months on the 9th of next month. Because I'm a researcher in this work and I study survival reactivity, I study emotional processing, that's a big part of the work I do. It was grueling and appalling and terrible, but also pretty fascinating to watch myself go through different real clear stages of survival reactivity in the days following finding out about his passing. I first went into just a legitimate hypervigilance where I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus, I couldn't listen to people, I couldn't sit still. I would wake up frequently if I did fall asleep with a start. I would see things out of the corner of my eye. I would hear noises that sounded like something predacious. And that went on for a few days. And during that time, strangely to me anyway, it was as though I had gotten a bad sunburn, how much skin I shed, which I'd never really even heard of. But
yeah, that's a unique.
it might be somewhat unique, but fits with me. It fits in line with the idea of a prolonged survival reaction and just like shedding off anything that might be at risk. But I think there's a little bit to where our nervous system is trying to figure out, am I in danger from what took my person down?
Mm-hmm.
So the hypervigilance went on for a while. Then for me, there was a prolonged period of what I think of as like a Hypo-Arousal Appease, where it's not real active, not trying to please a bunch of people, but laid back, hoping that I could somehow get out of it. It was like a totally illogical, and not even fully thought process, but like, maybe it's not true. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe they got it wrong. Maybe it's not really him.
Yeah.
I guess there's one other part that I skipped over, which was the initial freeze. When I first got the text message, I just put my phone down and I could tell that like my brain, my whole nervous system was just trying to slow down the import of the information. I felt like it had been injected into me. And if I didn't move too fast, or I didn't say anything about it, or I didn't think about it too much, then I could slow down. And this was actually something that was kind of occurring to me in the background of my thoughts. In the moment, I had this sense I could slow down the reality of it and maybe figure it out, and maybe avoid what it seemed like was actually happening.
I think that I experienced that. I used to do a lot of cliff jumping. And when I would jump off a cliff, the moment of jump and the moment of fall, even though it was technically like 3 to 6 seconds total, it felt like minutes, almost like when your body is rushed with adrenaline, your perceptions open so that you can take in as much possible stimuli as possible because you're going into that state of heightened nervous system. So it's like your senses open so that you can receive massive amounts. And that's super fascinating that that's happening to you in this moment of receiving information, of like time gets slower. And I really think it's like senses opening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that was a little like where I could watch myself just for the first few days, just like fully in survival reactivity and just hanging out there as my nervous system tried to come to terms with, am I literally in danger from what happened to my person?
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you? You had a,
Yeah, so I have a very, very recent example. Just last night, I got a call from someone who's very close to me, and he was sexually assaulted in public by a stranger. And it was the first time this has ever happened to him. And I just posted something on Instagram about how to respond to people surviving sexual assault. So I think it makes sense that I'm the one who was called. And I was like, I'm supposed to be the expert on this. So I went into immediate like holding space and problem solving mode. And then we eventually decided to report it. And then I held space for him as he was going through the reporting process.
Mm.
And that was from like 10 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. last night. And then it had sort of, the immediacy of it had resolved. And he like went on with his night, didn't need me anymore. And then I was like, oh no, is the world an unsafe place? Do I need to like not leave my front door? Because, and I immediately went into exactly what you said. This thing just happened to my person. Is that also a threat to me? Is the world also unsafe to me? And then it led to me getting like a super heightened nervous system state where I started getting flashbacks of my own sexual assault. And at that point, I recognized, I was like, oh, I'm about to have a panic attack. And I saw it coming on. And I called someone else, to a different person, to help me through it. And then I was able to come down from that just by having someone on the phone with me for about an hour of just like me processing the fact that this other person got assaulted, and then just kind of unpacking and figuring out what the heck is going on with society. Why does this keep happening? And then I was eventually able to fall asleep, and I was like actually falling asleep on the phone, which was optimal. So I was like, hey, I'm falling asleep. I'm going to hang up now. So I hung up and fell asleep.
Mm.
And then I had wildly anxious, deep Inception dreams all night where I woke up from my dream like 5 times, but I was still in another dream. Like I was so desperately trying to come out of this anxious state by waking up, but it just didn't work until the 5th time. Then I actually woke up into this reality, which was a relief. And there was just a lot of extreme tightness in my chest, in my belly. I woke up at like 6 a.m. and I was like, no, I need more sleep. So I put on a sleep meditation to help me fall back asleep. I eventually fell back asleep, fell back into more deep cycling Inception dreams, and then woke up to my alarm this morning and was like, well, that was not restful sleep. And then I spent the morning using all of the tools that I know to get myself regulated, to come down from it. And I'm so grateful that I have those tools and that I know how to self-regulate in a somewhat quick timeline compared to people that don't have the tools to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I don't want to get too meta about it, but it is sort of fascinating that we're going to have this session today. We're going to do this talk, let's have this conversation, and then you and I had some back chat about whether or not we should actually have this conversation, because we knew, or you knew what you were going through, you shared it with me. And I just want to share a little bit of that conversation because I think it's important, an important part of what we're doing here.
Yeah, please.
You and I actually investigated whether or not to do this conversation today, or if you needed to take some time and do some more resourcing and take good care of yourself instead. And it gave us this opportunity to just talk a little bit about how part of the point that we want to make here is to make room for our processing. And so when something comes up, even if we have an appointment, if it's more important for us, if our tools maybe aren't supporting us fast enough, or what's right for us to do is to pause the appointment or to postpone it in some way so that we can do our processing, that may be something that we need to do sometimes.
Yeah, like kind of frequently, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Way more than we give ourselves room to at this point. And I think part of the argument we want to make is give yourself more room to do that. Right?
Yes.
And so we talked about whether or not we should have this conversation. I just wanted to let people in on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's good transparency to have.
Yeah. But I do want to ask you some about tools. But so what was some of what you did for yourself this morning to help yourself?
I started by I'm embarrassed to say this out loud, but I'm gonna be transparent. I
But
started by trying to have a good poop this morning.
yeah.
And it did not come easily. I was like, I'm gonna go and like really relax because if I start my day with a good poop, I will feel so much better in my body than if I'm holding onto the anxiety so much that I don't let it out. So
Mhm.
that was the first thing I did.
I'm so glad you're
Um,
willing to share that. Really. It's so important and so useful. Appreciate you.
yeah. And then I did some aromatherapy. I have a carrier oil. I put some geranium and cedarwood, which are super grounding, calming, sedating oils, also anti-anxiety oils. And I rubbed my entire body down with that and just started letting the aromatherapy do its work. Then I went on a walk with my dog for about 5, 10 minutes. And I really, when I was on the walk, I was really paying attention to the moments where I was in the sunshine and the sensation of the sunshine on my skin. And I was like, wow, sunshine on my skin feels so nourishing. And I paused for a few moments because I live in a very tree dense area. And whenever I got to a patch of sunshine, I would just pause and be like, oh, this sunshine is wonderful. I got home from the walk. I made myself a really grounding breakfast. I had chorizo, which is very dense and grounding, with eggs and tortillas and cheese and salsa. And that was just like nourishment. And for me, cooking is very grounding. I love to cook. And I was like, I'm gonna take time this morning to really nourish my physical needs. And then after that, I went and I sat and did some super intentional deep breaths. Oh, I also picked out jewelry for the day. And that might not sound like self-care, but it really, to me, it really is of like, I'm going to pick myself up. I'm going to adorn myself with these earrings and this necklace and this ring. I like took off all of yesterday's jewelry and chose a new jewelry ensemble for today. And none of these things are actually conventional tools that I usually give to my clients.
Yeah.
But the wisdom behind it is that I listened to my intuition of what I needed this
Yeah.
morning. And then I
Absolutely.
did that.
Yeah. So beautiful. Is it okay if I underscore some of what I hear and what you're sharing? Because I think there's some beautiful processes, and I know that folks hearing just what you described will be able to model some choices of their
Hmm.
own after. But I
Hmm.
want to kind of give them a sense of some of what was working or some of what works in what you were doing.
Yeah.
So just from a nervous system point of view, putting on the oil, you mentioned that. No, the good poop. So taking, not to put too much emphasis on that, since I know you felt some vulnerability sharing it, but I do think that tending to our bodies is such an important part of nervous system
Mm.
regulation and survival system support. There's a whole range of tools to use, and we can talk some more about some other ones. But this basic idea of tending to the body, so that the body is sending signals to the nervous system that we're safe, we're okay. Look, I'm rubbing this oil on, I'm relaxing for a good poop, so there's not going to be pressure in my belly. I often tell people, make sure you go pee, like that too. But this way of using the body to signal to the nervous system that whatever's happening in the world around me, whatever I'm navigating internally, I'm not currently in danger.
Hmm.
So the good poop, the taking the time with the oils, the particular aromatherapy oils that you chose, but also that light touch on your body,
Hmm.
for the amount of time that it takes to oil your whole body gets oxytocin going, which is
Hmm.
the antidote to cortisol. And so you're de-stressing with just that loving touch, right?
Hmm.
Oh, the other thing, one of the other things that struck me was the sunlight. At least the sunlight and the jewelry I think of as really beautiful orienting techniques of like, this is my body in present time, experiencing a thing, the sun on my skin. Here's where I am.
Hmm.
Here's what's happening to me right now.
Yes.
Another great way, if we're in survival mode, to downregulate, to prove to our nervous system that, again, whatever's happening internally or for me in my life, this moment right now doesn't have any predators in it. Maybe I don't need to be in survival mode.
Hmm.
I love the jewelry too, because I think there's like the beautiful element of clearing what you had from yesterday as part of
Hmm.
it. but then also this intentional choice of bringing in elements, or it's an orientation, like here I am, I'm putting on an earring, I'm putting on another earring, I'm putting on this necklace right now for this day. But there are also the particular choices can be like anchors, right? Things that you enjoy or that feel good.
This necklace was my grandmother's. This ring was my mother's. And these earrings were gifts from a close friend of mine. So it's like I'm pulling their love onto my body, and I'm like adorning myself with their love as a reminder.
Yeah. And we can do that with basically anything. Like I often have a crystal with me, like I do right now, which is a physical anchor for me as well, helping me
Mhm.
ground my nervous system. I like the particular one that it is, this quartz, Lemurian quartz, but also just having a thing that I like in my hand that my nervous system can tell, oh, this is a thing you like, and it feels like this, and you're getting nerve ending data that's not a tiger biting you, all of which are
Yeah, I
very,
have a crocheted water bottle holder in my hands right now.
yes.
And this is what I keep my microphone in to
Oh,
like protect it from getting banged up. And I was like, oh, well, it's right here. And it feels good. I'm like actively doing this below the camera screen.
perfect.
Yeah,
Yes. So continuing to ground and orient ourselves even as we have this conversation, which I think is
absolutely.
useful to share with people, that we're doing that and you can do that. Like in the course of your normal day, you can have something like that. You can pick jewelry that is an anchor for you and grounding for you. You can pause for moments in the sunlight to allow that present mindedness and orientation to help ground you. Taking the time that you did with self-care and with, especially light touch, putting the oil on, these kinds of things are easily workable into whatever kind of day we're having if we're really activated,
Hmm. Hmm.
especially around our grieving process or like navigating something like you did last night.
Hmm.
I want to also, if take a moment to just make sense a little bit too. I mean, we've intimated it already, but just a couple more minutes to help people really understand that this kind of activation is so normal after an intense event. So, do you want to say anything about that? What comes up for you around that?
It's almost to be expected. It's not like, oh, this is happening. Why am I so weird? Why am I so dysregulated? Why am I so traumatized? It's like, no, this is actually your body's natural response to trauma.
Yeah.
And something that also comes to mind for me is that people enduring long forms of trauma that keeps happening over time can learn to just exist in this survival state as their normal.
Mhm.
And for those people, it's so much harder to unlearn survival state, to learn how to operate in a state of peace, that like it takes months or years
Yes.
to unlearn it. If you're in chronic survival state for months or years of your life because of ongoing traumatic events, it will take months or years to learn that you don't need to operate in that state anymore.
Yeah, I think there's two, I think, branches that people put this kind of trauma in, typically like a thing that happens to us,
Mhm.
whether it's a period of thing like going to war or, a terrible car accident or some other sort of instantaneous trauma,
Yes.
or developmental, like where we grow up in an environment that is unsafe and our nervous system learns to and programs around trying to stay safe in that environment.
Yeah.
I think in the first case, there's this, it's of course, a very normal shock response for the nervous system to be like, okay, something bad, really bad happened. We should be watching out so that we don't die, and it does. And it'll,
Mhm.
depending on the intensity of it and the kind of support that we get in the aftermath, it'll stay heightened for some time, just trying to figure out, are we safe, are we safe, are we safe, looking for all the evidence of either being safe and or not. And like you say, it can take however long we're in that environment and experiencing that intensity of whatever sort, take that long to come out of it or to work through or to reprogram what.
I think that people can also get stuck in it if they don't know how to come out of it and they don't get the help to come out of it. They can just get stuck in that state for their entire lives.
Yes. So let's continue. I want to continue to delineate these two groups and then bridge them with what you're talking about there.
Yes.
So I do think that grief tends to go, or like losing a loved one tends to go in the category of this sort of episodic, terrible thing, intense experience that has happened to us, and that we then, our nervous system tries to figure out if we survived it and how we continue to survive it.
Mm-hmm.
The developmental version, where we get programmed, that I think it takes much more of a concerted effort to work through, a lot more support, a lot more time, a lot more consistency, and has a greater likelihood of being the kind of thing that we, because of the neural habits built around it, we can get stuck in.
Yes. And if you have the background of the intense trauma and then you go through an acute trauma, they marry and it's horrible.
Yes, yes. As you intimated or intuited exactly where I was going next. So yeah. So then when we do have that, then for those of us who have, we'll just use the word trauma, although I think it's a much more, I don't always lean on that word because I think it doesn't say enough about all the experiences we have that go into something like that. And it sort of flattens or over categorizes itself in a way. But for ease now, while we're trying to talk about it, those of us with some sort of developmental trauma or early life trauma, or who have collected all the ACEs, then when we go through any kind of grief process or episodic trauma later in life, we can really have a much harder time coming out of it, and or go much deeper into survival reactivity around those experiences.
Yes. And I want to take a moment to define ACEs is adverse childhood events. And the more you have, the harder it is to recover. Yeah. And I think it's like someone with less than 6 ACEs is pretty likely to turn out okay. And someone with more than 6 ACEs is very predisposed to like mental and physical illnesses later on in their lives.
Yeah, right. So it makes sense then episodic or even a periodic intense stressor like losing someone or going to, into war or something like that could more dramatically affect, or for maybe a longer period affect, someone who has that sort of, let's just say, more sensitive programming.
Yeah.
But it's also really normal for any of us, no matter what our background was like, to go through something like losing someone, or even the brush with danger that you were involved with last night, and have survival reactivity come up around that. One thing that I often think about in terms of this is the just really normal, like, life on the Savanna human experience. That when we were developing these amazing brains that we have, if one of us was in danger, it was really useful for the other nervous systems around to know that at a distance, to, like, whether we let out a yelp or not, be able to feel our activation. And I think normally, in a predator situation, we would get the scare. If we survived it, we'd, do whatever survival thing we needed to do to survive, and then run back to the group and be like, oh my gosh, I almost died. It was so scary. And they're like, what? You almost died? That's so scary. Tell us all about it. Right. And for a moment, we're all in kind of like, do we need to still be in survival mode? Are we safe? But we talk about it, we process it, we network it together. And by doing that processing, we're able to get to an emotional brain state, process it, connect through it, continue to network it, and get back to a more executive state where that event doesn't land in our nervous system as trauma. Where, and we probably don't need to go too far into this, but where most of us wind up having trauma is because we don't wind up getting emotional support. We don't get help with the processing of what happened to us.
Yes. And that really comes to mind, the concept of nervous system co-regulation. And so what you just described is nervous system co-regulation with your community. What happened last night when this person called me immediately after an assault, like literally within 10 minutes, he was coming to me for nervous system co-regulation. And I was like, oh, this is my job. I went into like professional mode and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that for you. And then when it was over, I needed nervous system co-regulation. So I called my friend to help me co-regulate. And so it's really that getting support really affects how it lands, as opposed to just going through it and getting so dysregulated over such amount of time that the response from the trauma is traumatic.
Yes, well put.
This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center. where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com.
I want to be clear here, when we're younger and with the level of developmental trauma that many of us are carrying, help wasn't available, help wasn't coming. That's part of why we have the trauma that we have. It
Yes.
wasn't our fault that we didn't get help. We didn't go out and seek help. We didn't be like, hey, help me, just want to make it clear that we're not putting that on anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And even where we are now, with whatever we're navigating, if we need support, it's a difficult thing to reach out for, especially in a grieving process when we're not sure what we need. Embarrassing to still be going through it. Culture says be quiet about it, tidy it up, get on with your life in a few days. So it can be such a challenge to muster the courage to get any support at all, much less support that can actually be co-regulating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so stigmatized to ask for help in our culture. And if you grew up your entire childhood and adolescence not getting it, it can be so hard to learn that it's a good idea to do it as an adult. And I want to just put the message out there that it's a great idea.
Yes. Yeah, we're built to make use of that. We're built to have an easier time when we can lean into each other.
Yeah.
And like we're making the case here, you're less likely to come away from any intense experience with lasting trauma if and when you do get some support.
Yeah. And that kind of actually feels like a very natural segue into, in my opinion, emotional overload is when you are dealing with emotions and your nervous system is unregulated.
Yeah.
And that's the overload is the nervous system dysregulation and the not knowing what to do with so many emotions that the processing of the trauma is traumatic.
Yeah.
Whereas the emotional processing is the being regulated. And often that means being co-regulated with another person there and being able to go through the emotions in a slow way that's not re-triggering or re-traumatizing.
Yeah, and there's a range here too that I think it's useful for us to talk some about as we explore this terrain. I think it's exceedingly normal, very natural to have heightened levels of survival reactivity come up in the immediate aftermath of finding out that we've lost someone or losing someone, if we're with them when they pass. Maybe especially if we're not with them when they pass, though, because our nervous system is trying to figure out what is the danger, where is it coming from, am I susceptible to it? And maybe even if it's sudden versus if we knew about it coming, right? But then, and so that's really normal to come up at first. And I think it's incredibly useful to reach out to people, be with the people who are nearby to us to help us regulate, let's just talk about some strategies real quick. We talked about orienting. I'd love to share another orienting technique. We shared about the light touch, which I think is really useful because it's neurochemically working to support us to be more regulated. Also, just long, easy, boring hugs from people that we trust. And I say boring, not like too massagey and certainly not getting romantic, but just like hold me, I often like to use a regulating breath. Do you do that? Do you breath
Oh
work?
yeah, like daily.
For folks who don't know, a great regulating breath for this moment is to just make sure your inhale, although full, takes about half as long as your exhale. So you get in a rhythm of quickish full inhales and long, slow, drawn out exhales, and you just keep that rhythm going.
Yeah, there's an app that I use for that called Breathe. And you can just set it to like do the dings at the right time of like the inhale is 4 seconds, the exhale is 8 seconds, and it just dings for you for as long as you want it to.
Beautiful.
And so sometimes I'll do that while I drive. Sometimes I do it while I'm on a walk. Sometimes I'll like be like, I'm meditating and I'll sit down and do it. Like, this is meditation. But like, it doesn't have to be. You're always breathing. So you can theoretically always do this technique.
Yeah. And you carry your breath everywhere. So it's a really great one to use no matter where you are and as often as you like. You can't overdo it. Along the lines of the app you were talking about for folks who, maybe the Luddites among us, I often recommend too, some folks like to use a count. They'll count 1, 2, 3, 4 in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I go to like 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever it is, out.
Yeah.
That can also be useful because the counting is another thing for your brain to focus on instead of, is something coming to get me?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the light touch already. I like to, with my regulating breath, I'll bring in a little light touch. I like to put my palm to my chest. And I recommend that in part because the heart meridian comes out the palm and it's nice for a little energetic circuit to connect it to the heart source. But there's also nerve endings here across the front of our chest and in our palms that are part of called the social engagement system, but it's also part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So we're doing more parasympathetic activation. But like you did with putting the oils on, if you keep that touch going for 30 seconds or more, then we're releasing oxytocin in our brains as well, which, as we said, is an antidote to cortisol, so helps us de-stress. I have one other orienting technique I'd like to share. Do you have another?
Please go. I'm in listening brain right now.
Okay. This one is one I recommend to folks frequently, in part because, as we said already, the survival system is trying to figure out, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? And in that space of hypervigilance, it can make what are called prediction errors that we aren't safe. And this gets into what you were talking about earlier of how we can get stuck in emotional overload and in survival reactivity, because the nervous system essentially begins to validate its own prediction errors. Like, oh, that was something scary I heard. Oh, I did see something out of the corner of my eye, right?
Yeah.
So this technique called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, maybe you've heard about it, is a way to introduce sensory data to our nervous system that's current and proves that we're not currently being chased by a predator. So we name to ourselves, I think it's really useful to say the words out loud, but you can at least say them in your head. 5 things that you can see immediately with you that aren't a tiger. 4 things that you can touch or feel that are already touching you. I often go for like my waistband or my feet on the floor or something. 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And if you, for whatever reason, don't have one of your senses, the use of one of your senses, you can always exchange things I can think. A lot of folks lost their smelling during COVID. So 2 things I can think instead of 2 things I can smell.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I do love that one and I do use that one. Another one to add is a sense of awe and beauty is so naturally regulating. So, like going on my walk this morning, I was in awe of the feeling of sunlight on my skin. Another thing that I love to admire while on walks is just the flowers that my neighbors grow. And I'm just like, and I will just stop and really be like, this flower is so beautiful. And sometimes I'll pick it and like put it behind my ear. And I'm like, I'm doing that, adorning myself, taking the awe and beauty with me for the next few hours until the flower wilts. If you garden, I think one of the most miraculous things that exists is watching a seed grow into a ginormous thing. I love to grow sunflowers, and it just blows my mind when a seed this big turns into a 15-foot tall plant in 3 months. I'm just like, wow, this is so amazing. And then watching the pollinators come and visit your garden, or going to a local botanical garden or local rose garden. And that's also going to like fill up your resiliency cup and really like nourish you on, it's so much more than just nervous system regulating, but it also is nervous system regulating.
I also want to just touch on the fact that when we go out into nature, there's that we're great for our resilience, but it's also networking some of this activation because we are connected to the earth in a similar way that we are connected to other humans. So we can, when we're out in nature, there is this natural element of networking some of that activation, like we would do if we went and hugged someone that we love.
And some people who are not in the practice of going into nature, I just want to speak to like, it doesn't mean you need to like drive into like a mosquito ridden, like really 4-wheel drive destination lake. Right. Nature can be in your neighborhood park.
Yes.
Nature can be in your neighborhood closest body of water, even if it's like a duck pond.
Yes. Yes. So important to underscore that. When I started having children and it was a little bit more of a challenge to get out and do hiking, I really got into gardening because it's like bringing the nature into the yard, and so
Hmm.
we don't have very much grass. We have all kinds of little beds and stuff around our yard instead
Yeah.
now. And you get to watch like the unfolding of that micro nature, So, okay, so that's some about like supporting ourselves when we know that when there is survival reactivity up, and even if if the emotional expression and or processing has gotten so elevated that it becomes emotional overload, which I actually think of as going into survival,
Hmm.
where we've been sitting with a feeling maybe, but we're getting so activated around it that we're starting to drift into a more of a survival mode while the emotional activation is still happening. So doing those sorts of things can support us to stay out of survival mode, even though the emotion might still be big, might still be painful, might still need to have other kinds of movement and support. We're at least keeping ourselves in that window of tolerance so that we're in emotional brain as we do this emotional processing, and we can actually then move that emotion rather than, as you say, re-traumatizing ourselves by going into survival around it.
Hmm.
So maybe do you want to talk a little bit about some like emotional processing things that you
Yeah,
like?
I think that the biggest reason people don't emotionally process is because they are afraid of emotional overwhelm,
Yes.
which is really ironic because their lack of emotional processing leads to emotional overwhelm.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, yeah. It's like they
Um,
save it up, save it up, save it up, and then it's this huge thing that needs a lot more room and time.
exactly. And so, in my opinion, emotional processing is a daily practice. Constantly releasing. I like to use the phrase that emotions are energy in motion, and you need
Mm,
to let them be in motion through your body.
yes.
And so, to do that, you can journal with them, you can actively emote them, like with your physical body. You can do like the notice, name, touch, where you name the emotion, feel it in your body, get some physical touch.
Yes.
It can be a therapy session or a coach or something where you're going through and that person is holding space for you. For me, it also is playing musical instruments. I get massive amounts of emotional release from playing my musical instruments because I'm expressing my emotions in this spiritual, non-verbal, non-logical, like other wavelength, literally other wavelength form. And when people hear my music, they're like, whoa, that was intense. And I was like, yeah, I wrote that song on an intense day.
Yeah, yes. Ah, such a potent form of expression to use
And for
our.
people who don't play instruments, singing
Mhm.
is such a good expression. And it's nervous system regulating because you're slowing your breath down as you're doing long exhalations while you sing.
Yes, yes, yes. So beautifully put. So, if I'm able to do it justice, I'd like to reflect
Mhm.
on some of what you talked about and underscore some of the things that you mentioned, but put it in the context of how people might wind up running into it, right? So, if they're
Yeah.
in the middle of a grieving process and they're not in survival reactivity, then often they're overcome by some feelings that are just coming out, whether they can stop it or not, right? They've tried to suppress it most of their life, so they have a high volume. So when it comes, it's coming. And, maybe they didn't know they could let it out. I said try to suppress it. I'm not trying to blame anyone. We learn the tools that we learn to get through life the way we can get through life. And
Mhm.
many of us learn to eschew our uncomfortable feelings as a way to get through life. But for those of us going through a grieving process, there's this thing that's happened that's it's coming for us, and it's really hard to ignore. And so many of us have that emotion that just upwells. In a moment like that, I definitely think doing some of the regulating techniques we already talked about so that you can be sure that you're not going into survival mode around it and
Mhm.
tend to that part of your nervous system. But then you called it notice, name, touch. That's the process that we teach at the Center for Emotional Education. Thanks for mentioning it. That is so useful for surface emotion that's coming up, and we just need to be with it and need to be able to kind of regulate our way through it, right?
Mhm.
Notice, name, touch, like you said, just tuning into what is happening to me. What's the story I'm telling myself? What's the experience I'm having in my body? What can I notice about it? naming the feelings. Often I think it's useful to name at least 2 or 3 feelings so that we're being sure we're really getting in there, but saying to ourselves the words of or the names of those feelings. And here I think it's really important to make sure, because we're trying to process through and get to the other side of this feelings moment, that we use words that aren't more narrative. And there's some tricky ones in there, like, oh, in our culture, we say things like, I feel so betrayed. I feel so left out. I feel done wrong. I feel ignored. I feel unloved. And all of those are experiences we have for sure, but they're not actually emotions. And when we tell ourselves, I feel that way, and that's what we're naming, we're telling more of the story. We're doing more of the noticing of our experience. And that's sort of, I call that digging the well. We're just continuing to dig the well instead of pulling any of the buckets of water out.
Yeah.
Naming it then also helps our brain change, kind of shift the way we're processing it. It helps us make sense of the experience that we're having in our bodies and in our story, and can help the brain begin to be like, oh, okay, so I don't need to go into survival mode. I don't need to be ready to fight anything off. We're just having a feeling. I got you. And then some touch. We already talked about some self-touch. I also think this is a great time to get a boring hug from someone that we trust. And here too, I think it's really useful. We can coach our partners who often are like, oh, you're upset. What do I do? Let me help you. I'll fix it. They'll just tell me what to do. Especially in the grieving process, there's zero for them to do, right? The person is not coming back. So there's no fix. But even in a situation like you ran into last night, where you're supporting someone who went through something, really intense, and then you had feelings coming up and you wanted to share them, letting our people know that they don't need to fix anything. I just need to talk about these feelings for a bit. If you could just hold me while I do it, while I name, talk about my experience and name these feelings, that's all I need you to do. It can really take the pressure off of our support people.
Yeah, I just want to like highlight that. Yes, 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 yes. Coach them how to hold space for you, because they don't know how. I mean, if they do, that's awesome, but it's most likely that they don't.
Right. Yeah. So I like to use that term of just a boring cuddle. Just give me a boring cuddle while I cry on you for a little bit, and then I'll be good. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to do anything. Maybe say, "Oh yeah, I get it," occasionally. So that, I think, like for the feelings that are just coming up, and we need to kind of be with them so that they're not stuck in us and we're not suppressing them, and so they can move. As you say, I love that energy and motion, allowing them to move through us. Notice, name, touch is a beautiful process. Some of the other stuff you talked about, I think I put in the category of intentional emoting strategies. And I think we talked about this in another, because you described your process so beautifully, that involves some emoting strategies. And that's the things like journaling, dancing. I'll do an intentional emoting practice where I start by journaling. Well, no, actually start by regulating. So I'm sure that my nervous system is completely regulated for this process. Then I do some journaling about the story of the thing that I'm having some feelings about, that I want to work with in the grieving process, right? Like, I miss you, I love you, I wish you weren't gone, I wish you hadn't left me here, all kinds of stuff like that, to kind of allow that feeling to come up and to put it somewhere. So that by itself is a kind of expression, both physical and vocal, because I'm writing words. And then I'll stand up, or whatever is right for me, begin to put my body in postures and allowing physical movements that go with that feeling. For grief and sorrow, it's been, for me, there's like a lot of like crumpling down and folding over and postures like that. But there's also sort of like head back howling motions and postures I've done that are, I think, really useful. Again, both physical and vocal. Then I think, so putting my body in postures, allowing movements, allowing sounds, allowing words to come out, and then going back to a more regulated state, and then doing another round, and then going back to a more regulated state, and then another round, so that I'm sure that I'm expressing a full amount of what I want to express, but also, kind of as we've been making the point this whole conversation, keeping my nervous system in a window of tolerance so that I don't go into survival mode and traumatize myself with this.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
For someone that has lived most of their life in a dysregulated nervous system state, how do you think that person should navigate emotional processing, given that they don't yet have the skill of self nervous system regulating?
That's what I think, some of what we've talked about and you mentioned already, and I also wanted to underscore, going and getting support from someone that can hold the space,
Uh-huh.
talking at them.
Yeah.
you know I think there's really important space and necessary use for what we call talk therapy, but I also think there's a lot more that you can do when you're talking with someone than just talk therapy. But even if that's all you're doing, especially as part of your grieving process, just saying, this is happening for me and this is happening for me and I'm thinking about this all the time and I miss them here and I wish that this happened, even if that's all you're doing, that
Mm-hmm.
is so useful at that time, especially to just
Mm-hmm.
express some of what you've been carrying.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing it with another regulated nervous system, then you're less likely to get tripped up and end up in survival yourself, more likely to be able to approach it from a slightly more regulated place.
Yeah.
But I think it's difficult too, because so many of us didn't get emotional support growing up. So we have heightened nervous system activation in general, greater likelihood of going into survival, fewer tools to get out of it, fewer tools to process the emotion, experience in an environment where that's safe. And so this whole thing becomes really fraught just because of the programming we have.
Yeah, it's almost as though we need to have a brand new education
Word. Yeah. Yes, yes,
of
yes.
how to even do it. It's like
Yeah.
that is like a whole thing to learn how to do.
Yeah, learn how to do it for ourselves and then learn how to
Mhm.
do it with someone else when we're supporting them, so that we don't push them into survival mode or allow ourselves to take on too much of what we're holding space for with them and throw ourselves into survival mode.
Mhm.
How to really network that emotion usefully. So yeah, I think if you've spent most of your life in a dysregulated state, and really, frankly, the majority of us have, until we begin to get access to these tools and or get access to support or get lucky enough that someone comes along and helps us get off that track. So for most of us, I think finding some support is really so important in terms
Yeah.
of doing this in a way that is going to be useful for you and like healing, and not just healing what you're currently going through, but the history that you're carrying too.
And what would you say? I've heard so many people I know say this. What would your response be to this statement? Oh, I don't need therapy. I have friends.
This is great. We could do a whole episode on this. I think friends, if you got nothing else and you can't afford any support at all, or you can't figure out a way to barter or trade for support, then friends are often better than nothing.
Hmm.
Not always better than nothing.
It depends on the friend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
often better than nothing. I mean, if they're going to give you a bunch of bad advice and or like, take you to the bar and get you all loaded up and stuff like that as part of a grieving process, I'm not sure that's very helpful at all. But even a not therapeutic friend can sit with you while you cry and hold you. Yesterday I had a friend, they don't know anything about the work I do or, this kind of thing, but they asked me how I was doing. I said, it's been a pretty hard day, but I'm doing okay. And they didn't know anything other than to give me a hug at the end of our conversation. And I was like, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That meant a lot to me.
Hmm.
That was helpful, right? But I do think by and large, our friends are not great support for this kind of work because they don't have tools. They can't even help themselves. And so we go and dump this out at their feet. Most of them are going to pick it up and like carry it around with them for a while, trying to figure out what to do with it. And they may not want to hang out with us as much anymore because like we're always doing this grieving thing. You'll see a lot of friends are also like, but look on the bright side, at least you had all that time with the person that you lost, or they're in a better place now. I fucking hate that one. They're in a better place now. You don't know where they are. Don't be telling me anything about a better place. You don't even know what I think about a better place. Friends can be really not very useful in that capacity.
To add to that, if you do have a friend that has tools, they are probably the friend that everyone goes to, and they should probably be paid
Yes.
for
Yeah.
holding that space for you.
It might also be their job that they do
It
get paid
probably also
for.
is their job.
Yeah.
And you're just trying to get it from them for free because you know them through a friendship level, not through a professional level. A few years ago, I had to really work on my boundaries with my friends because I found myself being the emotional caretaker of everyone in my life. And I had to be like, oh, I need to not do this. This is my job.
Hmm.
And it's a conflict of interest for me to do this for my relatives.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's so important for those of us who are in the support industry of any sort, because we're doing it all day. We need those periods in between the work that we're doing to not be doing that work. So yeah, going to your one friend who has tools that everybody else goes to, and it's probably their profession, you might maybe go to them, but see if they're willing to take you on as a client, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, the other thing that our friends do is they frequently will drive the conversation toward themselves. You know, like, oh, yeah, that thing happened to you. That reminds me of this terrible thing that happened to me. Let's talk about that for an hour instead. Just like, okay, great. You know, like, we're friends. That's what friends do. But if you really want support, if you really want to have the kind of help going through, navigating it, actually processing through and doing the healing that's available for you in a grieving process or any emotional process, going to someone who knows what they're doing is really just like you would for your car, or like you would for, you know, anything else that matters to you that
For your hair.
yeah, you would get a professional to help you with it.
Yeah.
There was one thing I don't want to step over because it dovetails with a few of these things that we've just been talking about. We talked about physical emoting strategies. We talked about vocal emoting strategies. I also want to just take a second to talk about ritual emoting strategies, because that's where we could write some things out in the journal and then tear it up and set it on fire. Like, that makes a ritual out of it, right? Or we
Yeah.
can burn candles, you know, like I had a candle going every day for 3 months after my brother passed. Just kept that candle going as a ritual emoting process, right?
Yes.
I also want to bring in, because there's this opportunity, and it's in your wheelhouse, for folks who have spent a fair amount of their lives in dysregulation and they need support. And sometimes talking about it is really, really difficult because you don't have any practice doing that. And it by itself can be a scary thing to do as part of the process, to talk about it and to vulnerably share what's going on for us. So if you have that history, and if it's a struggle for you to talk about it, and you know, maybe even there's some challenge being with the feelings that come up for you, notice, name, touch can help you, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe doing physical or vocal emoting strategies isn't your jam. Going to someone who practices, who can support you with Reiki, who can support you with energy work, is
Yeah.
such an important and useful tool to help your nervous system, to help the energy that you're trying to move, and can be this kind of ritual emoting strategy, because you go there, there's this practice that's done on you, and you're going through this ritual, this ceremony together with a support person to work with some of that feeling. And energetically, they can work with some of that feeling with you.
Yeah, maybe if you don't have the words for your emotions, or the words for your emotions are scary, but they're in your body, having Reiki move through that part of your body can be a magnificent clearing for your everything, like on all of the levels.
Yeah.
And also like sound healing, like the vibration of the singing bowls literally moving through your body. I started playing the harp about a year ago because it's such a healing instrument. And it's the vibration of the music moving through my body every day that I play. It's in your body, and there's so many ways to get it out. And so it's like, choose your cup of tea of how to get it out of your body. And certainly don't just leave it there.
Yeah.
Because it will turn into disease.
Right. Yeah. We haven't said much about that. We probably will have a conversation about that part in itself. But yeah, an emotion that stays in the body that we don't express, it winds up being expressed through the physical form, for sure. Yes. Okay.
Okay. I'm feeling pretty complete and a lot more regulated than I was at the beginning of this conversation.
Me too. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. I kind of had a feeling that would happen. That's why I was like, we should do it.
Yeah, same. So much, Selysa.
Thank you, Nathan.
Appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about this stuff. Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please hit the follow button wherever you're listening now. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. And don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.